Hello, everybody. My name is Sean Fox. I wanted to welcome all of you to Introduction to Psychology here at Herzing University. I'm very happy to start a new term with all of you and look forward to getting to know all of you as this term progresses. The information I'm going to present today for this lecture is going to cover everything you need to know for Unit 1, which also corresponds to the first week of class. In this lecture, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction and welcome you again all to this course. I'm also going to talk about the syllabus very briefly and also go over in a very brief way the course expectations. My view as a professor is that I'm not going to read to all of you word for word what's written in a syllabus. We're all adults. You all are college students. I don't want to patronize you by having to read a syllabus to you, but I will kind of just briefly touch on where to find the syllabus and to encourage all of you to read over it. After that, I'll talk about what assignments are going to be due during this first week of class. And then after that, I'll talk about the three main content areas that we're going to be discussing this week. So specifically for week 1, it's going to be generally kind of the theories and a little bit of the history of psychology. We'll talk about how psychology is a science. And then we'll talk about something called industrial organizational psychology, which essentially is a field within psychology that talks about applying psychological concepts in business settings, hence the organization, industrial part, to basically foster more productive, happier, healthier working environments. At the end of the lecture, I'll give you a little bit of information about contacting me and also a little bit additional information of kind of how to study for this week's topics. All right, so welcome and introductions. So again, welcome everybody to this class. Generally speaking, it's been my experience that most students that take this course in particular are just starting out with their college experience here at Herzing. So I always want to make the extra effort of reaching out to you and letting you know, kind of giving you a little bit more guidance of how to go through the course. Keep in mind that the lecture class meetings that we have weekly, those are completely optional. You do not have to show up for them. They don't count as extra credit. They don't count for your grade. They're set somewhat arbitrarily. Basically, I pick a day, usually a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, and at a certain time, and I just decide that's when I'm going to have my classes. I'll always record class lectures. Sometimes it's not really allowed for me to do it. And what I mean by allowed is, sometimes what happens is that a lot of students just don't show up for the class, or sometimes nobody shows up for the class. So it's kind of difficult for me to record a class lecture if it's just a student or nobody shows up. So what I do is I do have a reserve of different lectures where I go over the slides I was going to present and then give that to all of you. So even though attending the actual class lecture isn't required, it's totally optional, it is strongly encouraged that you watch these videos that I put out, either the recording of that class lecture or pre-recorded videos where I go over the information. Um, in addition to that, just a little bit of a background information about myself. You will find very quickly in this class, I'm a very hands-on professor. I am going to be contacting you all probably to the point that you're going to be maybe even a little bit irritated. I just want to let you know my goal here is not to irritate anybody, not to bother anybody. Rather, it's to connect with all of you and help guide you through this class. As I mentioned, kind of historically, this class does usually draw more college students that are new to the college experience. And online classes in particular are kind of notorious for a sense of kind of disconnect, and people usually get confused when they're taking those online classes. So my way of bridging that is to give a lot of guidance, a lot of support, to reach out to my students as much as possible. So you'll see that. I send out announcements, I'll send out individual messages, usually 2 or 3 times over the term. I'll reach out to you through Canvas inbox, just asking how things are going, if you need anything. At the end of the lecture today, I'll talk about the best ways to contact me. I'll talk about my office hours um, and other aspects that just kind of give you a little bit of tips for success in this class. I also have my own YouTube channel where I have different what I call micro learning videos. And whenever I post these lecture videos, I'll also include links to those videos. They're just additional resources, not anything that you have to review, but in the past I've had students say they're pretty informative. So I always like to share that with students too, just as another way of learning the material. As far as a little bit about myself, so I kind of have a non-traditional background when it comes to college professors, especially when it comes to college professor of psychology. Professionally, my background is actually in law enforcement. I worked as a deputy for the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office in the Tampa Bay area for about 19 years. I got injured and then kind of transferred my career to doing teaching of psychology and also to do counseling. So I have a graduate degree in psychology. I also have a graduate degree in clinical social work. And I work as a clinical social worker also. So the reason why I'm sharing this is as I go through some of the different concepts and terms today and also in future modules, I'm going to connect it with that background, right? So I will try to make these concepts, these terms, these theories as relatable as possible. And I think the best way of doing that is to share some stories, um, just to give you a little bit of context. And I think honestly, having the background in both counseling and law enforcement, I got some good stories, y'all. So I think you'll be entertained on that. Please, 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 one thing I definitely want you all to know about me as a professor, I am here to help you. I know sometimes professors just say that. I'm sure many of them do mean it. I absolutely mean it. The problem, though, is that I can send announcement after announcement after announcement. I can have 2 hours of office hours every week. I can email students, and it's not going to do one bit of good if you don't read those announcements, you don't read the emails, you don't go to office hours if you need help. Um, I can't just magically know when there's a problem, and how to fix it. It's a two-way street. So I can promise all of you as we start this term, I will reach out to you as much as possible. I will do my part. Please live up to your part though also, and respond to those emails. Reach out to me. Let me know if there's a problem. Let me know if there's anything that needs to be addressed. All right, so moving on, the syllabus and course expectations. So a couple different things to go over. The syllabus is right on the what we call landing page. So as soon as you click on this course in Canvas, it'll pull up at the bottom where it has the syllabus. Please review that syllabus, look over it. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. As I've mentioned before, I do send out a lot of different announcements. I try to make myself as available as possible in this term, in this class. But please, please, please convey to me if you have any kinds of concerns or problems, so they can be rectified as quickly as possible. Now, I'm not going to read a syllabus to you all. We're all adults. We all can read a syllabus. The one big thing, though, I want to make sure that I talk about is the late policy. So please make sure you are reviewing the university's policy as far as late work. I do not accept work that's more than a week late. And the way I look at a college class, as from the perspective of a professor and what I expect from my students, is kind of look at this like it's a job, right? And I can tell you right now, if it's a job, I'm a very lenient boss. If you can't make it to work, just let me know you can't make it to work, right? If you can't do an assignment, just let me know in advance. If you need more time, let me know in advance. Um, it's very important to know that. I can tell you right now, if you let me know a day before, 2 days before an assignment's due, that stuff is just difficult for you that week. And I don't mean like you're sick, you have a doctor's note, you're in the hospital, but maybe you're just too stressed. Maybe it's just a really difficult week for you. Maybe you had to work some extra shifts. Maybe your kids have just driven you crazy. I'm a parent, I get it, y'all. Email me. Let me know. Say, hey, Professor Fox, it's been a really bad week. Can I just get a little bit of an extension on this week's assignments? I'll give it to you. Key thing to keep in mind, that doesn't mean send me an email an hour before, 5 minutes before. Um, And don't do it after the fact. And this is where a lot of students get in trouble, right? Is that when you're sending me something 4, 5, 6 days after something is due saying, oh, well, no, the week before that was really busy. The message you're really sending me is you can't manage your time properly. I'm less inclined to work with students that can't manage their time properly versus ones who are proactively saying, I need to manage my time better. So something to kind of keep in mind there. Um, Weekly announcements. So I will always send out an announcement, several announcements throughout the week. Generally speaking, you're going to get an announcement talking about what we're talking about for that week on Monday of each week. So I'll mention what assignments will be due that week. I'll mention what topics we're covering. Usually on Tuesday or Wednesday, I'll send a recording of the lecture, the class lecture, or a pre-recorded lecture for the topics for that week, like this video. That usually comes out on Tuesday. Those are a minimum, right? I will probably send other announcements here and there, but you could always count on those two main announcements every week. During the first week, I will send out specific announcements covering APA guidelines. So that's American Psychological Association. In this class, we use APA 7th edition for all writing. Now, for discussions, it's a little difficult. If you reference anything as in text, you need to do that properly in APA. So both a reference section and an in-text citation. In addition to that, there are a few assignments that we'll have where you're essentially going to be writing a paper. So for those papers, not only do you have to do that exact same thing I just mentioned, in-text citations and a reference section, but you also will need to format the paper based on APA guidelines. So look for that announcement during the first week. It'll be very clear as far as what you need to do, and there'll even be a template included on how to do an APA paper. Additionally, AI use. I'm pretty lenient when it comes to AI, but there's a big but here, right? Dot, 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 but. And the but is my view of AI is it is a tool to help you learn. It is not a replacement for you thinking. It is not a replacement for you learning. And that is a big distinction to make. What's the difference? Well, the difference is if maybe I need a little bit of help on how to start a paper. I may use AI by saying, give me some suggestions on an introduction to use. I'm looking at those different responses and I'm picking which one sounds better, or maybe I'm taking a little bit from this response and a little bit from this response, and I'm coming up with something on my own. That is using AI as a tool. Using AI as a replacement for your own work would be like saying, do a discussion board post based on, and then you cut and paste the instructions for a discussion. And then you just cut and paste that response and put it as your response. You are learning nothing by doing that. You are not honing those skills that you need to hone in college, like writing skills, critical thinking skills, application skills. And to be pretty honest, you're just kind of wasting your money then. You're doing really good at cutting and pasting. So, I mean, I guess you get a college degree in that. But you're really kind of selling yourself short. And that may be well and good that it gets you an A, for an assignment here and there in a college course. But, the whole point of going to college is that when you graduate, you're expected to have the skills needed based on a college graduate. So once you start entering the corporate world, once you start entering the business world, or whatever your future goals are, they're going to expect you to have a skill set that you didn't spend 2, 3 years honing, like other people who aren't using AI as a replacement. So that's my little soapbox moment, y'all, just to let you know. Due dates, I already talked about that pretty extensively. If anybody has any questions about any of these things, please, of course, let me know. One thing I do want to mention about the due dates, I said I'm pretty lenient with that. The one exception to that is at the end of the term. So once it gets to the end of the term, sorry folks, I can't extend it anymore. All good things must end, including this class. So the end date for the term for this class is the end date. I can't extend that anymore. Anything prior to that, I'm pretty lenient on, as I mentioned, especially if you contact me beforehand. All right, so moving on. What assignments do we have due this first week? Well, there's 2 assignments that are due. The first one is going to be the Unit 1 discussion. For the Unit 1 discussion, you need to do an initial post by Wednesday prior to midnight. And all times for this class will be Central Time Zone. So Unit 1 discussion, you have to do an initial post prior to midnight on Wednesday. You then have until Sunday prior to midnight to respond to 2 other students' posts. Now, the other assignment that's due, and I'll come back on that discussion here in a second. The other assignment that's going to be due during this first week will be a paper. It's called a Unit 1 assignment. That'll be due prior to midnight on Sunday. So Unit 1 discussion, initial post due Wednesday prior to midnight. The 2 responses to other students' posts for that discussion and the Unit 1 assignment will be due the following Sunday prior to midnight. So let me talk about what these assignments are. Unit 1 discussion. So for this, what I want you to do is think about scenarios that come up or will potentially come up in your career. Please tell us your degree major in the first sentence of your discussion post. Now, I do want to say, as I've mentioned, a lot of times students take this class because it's their first or second semester. So if you don't really know necessarily yet what your career is going to be, you can just pick a career. If you have like 2 or 3 options, just pick one of them. Don't spend too much time kind of fretting over this. Or more broadly, you can talk about, the different types of careers that maybe you're looking to go into. That's totally fine. So don't worry too much about that. Of course, your major, you should know your major. You should have a major. Please share that with us in the first sentence. Now, the next thing I want you to do is to pick 1 or 2 of the theories that we're going to be learning about during this first week. And I want you to specifically select those theories based on how you think you can apply them to the workplace. Indeed, later on in this lecture, I'll talk about some of those different theories. So that's a clue, right? If you're wondering, like, well, what theories are you talking about? Well, in a little while, I'll talk about different theories and I'll reiterate then, like, hey, y'all, these are the theories I'm talking about. So you need to pick 1 or 2 of these. So once you select those theories, I want you to discuss how would these theories be applied in a workplace, in a career setting, a professional setting. Does your position in the company or wherever you happen to be working, government body, influence if psychology can be used? Why or why not? Here's a little bit of a hint, everybody. Psychology is everywhere. I oftentimes like to joke that one of the benefits of being a psychology professor is that you never really have to sell people on the idea of like, this is relevant, right? Because psychology is everywhere. Everything that we'll be using or talking about in this class, you use every single day, right? In your own personal psychology and everybody else's around you. So I would think most people would probably say it can be used. You have to tie it in some way. All right, next component of the discussion. Can you think of any career fields where psychology could not be impactful? That's going to be kind of hard. If yes, explain your reasoning. If no, what area are you most excited about learning more? So with that, you can look through the module section of this course. There's broad topics on there where it says what we'll be learning about. It's pretty comprehensive. I mean, this is a short term, but we're going to be covering a lot of different things. We'll talk about stress, we'll talk about motivation, we'll talk about personality, social psychology, learning, memory, all sorts of different things. So just pick one of those and explain maybe why you think that's the most interesting and why you want to know more information about that topic. Now, that's in your initial post. Remember, you need to respond to 2 other students' initial posts. Now, this is key. Discussion board posts are called discussion board posts because you're expected to have a discussion, right? Sounds like a no-brainer, right? But so often I feel like students get caught up in being kind of, I hate saying it like this, but superficial, right? So the peer responses are just a second thought, right? So you just go in and you type something like, oh my God, that was such a good post. Thank you for sharing, period. No, you will not get full credit if you do that. What I'm looking for here is substantive feedback. Think of you having an actual discussion with this person face to face. What would you say? What kind of feedback would you give that is actually meaningful? That doesn't just go beyond the superficiality of Good job, good post. The way I like to explain this is, in the United States, we kind of have this general thing of a greeting where we say, "Hey, how you doing?" And the other person says, "Hey, how are you doing?" Right? Nobody really answers it. It'd be weird if you did, like, "Hey, how you doing?" I'd be like, "Actually, I'm doing kind of bad today." People would be like, "Whoa, I didn't actually mean how are you doing?" Well, that's how people kind of look at these discussion board posts. I want to challenge all of you not to do that. Give actual, substantive, meaningful feedback to one another. Um, the two peer responses are due Sunday prior to midnight, and that does have to be for other students' posts. So, say if somebody responds to your post and then you respond to their response, that doesn't count. All right, so that is the first assignment. The second assignment is the Unit 1 assignment, which is really a paper. So, as we all progress through this course, we will learn more about ourselves and our own psychological makeup. For your initial assignment, write a 2 to 3 page APA formatted paper, again, APA 7th edition, formatted paper describing your personality traits that you believe will make you successful in your desired career path. Remember, the more honest we are with ourselves, the better off we will all be. Um, as a counselor, this is one of my big pet peeves, right? People go to counseling, they'll go to the therapist, but they won't really actually say what's on their mind, right? And they then get mad after like 5, 6, 7 weeks because nothing's changed. It's like, well, I'm not a mind reader. In this class, you'll see that we kind of do a lot of this self-reflecting like this. Now, you don't have to go too deep into it. We're not going to give you any assignments that are going to be super, super, super triggering or traumatic or anything like that. But think of it this way, right? The more effort you put in, the more you're going to get from this class. So apply it. For example, for me, if I was doing this assignment as a student, I want to be a therapist. I may talk about personality traits like how I'm really good at talking to people. I love listening. I can actually do active listening. I've always been kind of an empathetic, sympathetic type of person. People have always confided in me. So those are aspects of my personality that obviously would go naturally into being a therapist. It's kind of like essential skills of being a therapist. So that may be how I would go about it. And I'm just giving you that as an example. Think about what you know about yourself, what others say about you, and what you tell yourself, what others tell you, and think about what traits might evolve and change and what traits will not. Um, it's kind of an interesting thing. I also teach different classes, and whenever I teach human growth and development, which is sometimes known as developmental psychology, I first day of class have students write down 10 things about them, right? It can be anything. It could be something like a physical trait like hair color, skin color, eye color. It could be personality traits. It could be professions. It could be social things like if you're a member of a certain club. And then I ask them, I say, would that list, all those items on that list still define you if I asked you 10 years ago? How about 10 years from now? Do you think those things would still apply? Maybe some, yeah. I mean, my eye color hasn't changed in a long time. I won't tell you how long. Right? It probably won't change for the rest of my life unless I get contacts. But then some other things certainly will. Something like careers. I already mentioned how I had a big change of careers that was kind of unexpected, but it ended up being pretty good for me. So kind of dive into this. And remember, 2 to 3 pages, APA formatted, that does mean you do need to have a title page. For this class, you will never need an abstract. So no abstract, you do need a title page, APA formatted. And the Unit 1 assignment will be due Sunday prior to midnight. If any of you are a little bit unsure about the formatting or what needs to be put in it, at the end of the lecture today, I do have my office hours. I'll talk about that. It is on the landing page. I'll be more than happy to look at your papers if you show up to office hours and give you some feedback on it. All right, so now I'm going to move into what topics we'll actually be talking about during this first week. Now, keep in mind, the point of these lectures isn't to go into detail about every component of each chapter. If you need to know a little bit more about those different chapters, Of course, you look over the material that's provided in the class. That's the first thing you should do. When I send out these recordings, I'll include the links that I mentioned to YouTube videos that I've done on these topics. That can be another really good way for you to study material. And of course, if you get stuck on anything, just reach out to me, especially during those office hours. That's why I have them every week. So the first topic that we're going to be discussing this week is really kind of the basic foundations of the science behind psychology. So oftentimes, one of the first things students kind of have a question about is, you may know what psychology is, but if I asked you define what psychology is, you probably hit a little bit of a road bump there. You're probably like, well, I don't know. So psychology as a field explores how people think, they feel, and they behave. Oftentimes, you'll see that written as psychology is the science of mind and behavior. Or sometimes it's written the science of the brain and behavior. The key part of that, there's actually three key parts, right? The first one is psychology is a science. It is a social science. So it goes beyond just assumptions, thoughts, perspectives, beliefs, which I'll get into that in greater detail here in a second. So that's the first big component, right? Psychology is a science. Next one, psychology as a science kind of consists of two main areas of focus. The mind or the brain, right? The inner workings, like how you think, how you feel, your emotions, your memory, your intelligence, all sorts of different things, even things like language that you probably didn't even really tie into psychology. So that's one of the big pillars, right? The other big pillar here is the behavior. And that is everything that's observable, how a person acts, how they behave. And in psychology, a lot of times when we talk about behavior, we actually talk about learning, which I'll get back to that in about 2 slides when I talk a little bit about some of the theories of psychology. So one thing that's important to know also about psychology, and this kind of harps on what I just mentioned, that psychology is a science, is that it is distinct from philosophy because it relies on empirical evidence, not just intuition. So the reason why we're specifically saying philosophy is, we humans have wondered about why we do what we do for thousands of years, even probably long before the written word, the spoken word. I like to say that however far back we go, probably one of the first thoughts any human has ever had is trying to figure out why another human did something. It's kind of human nature. We spend a lot of time trying to think about why we do what we do, but especially why other people do what they do. That has been part of human nature forever. And philosophy is kind of an offshoot of that, right? So philosophy isn't a science, but it explores some of these things, like what's the meaning of life? Why do people do what they do? Why do they think the way they think? What distinguishes psychology from that is it goes beyond just assumptions or beliefs. If I'm at work and Bob is my coworker and Bob's really mean that day, and I just come up with the idea that, well, you know what, Bob must have had a bad night of sleeping, right? He just didn't sleep really well, and that's why he's being mean and nasty today. That's an assumption. It may be right, it may not be right. I don't know why Bob is the way Bob is, right? That's what we're talking about with philosophy. Psychology isn't based on that, right? It's not just coming up with an answer that sounds good and makes sense to you. It's coming up with the truth behind it, coming up with facts. So it transcends that, and it uses that empirical research, which I'll talk about here in a second. Key to empirical evidence, empirical research, is what we call the scientific method. So the scientific method is a formalized process of how to conduct the research, the science behind these studies, right? So it's rooted in a streamlined, straightforward, valid process of doing the research to make sure that we can say with confidence, what we're talking about in psychology isn't just a belief, it isn't just an assumption, it isn't just perspective, but it's rooted in the truth. Scientific method. In addition to that, Psychology is kind of famous for having a lot of different theories. I'll get into that a little bit later because I'll talk about those specific theories. Sometimes they kind of trip some students up. Um, some people look at it as being maybe one of the weaknesses to psychology is that there's a lot of different ways to explain how we think, feel, and behave. I look at it though as a strength of the field. So let me go on to the next slide, talk a little bit more about the scientific method. All right, so scientific method. As I mentioned, the scientific method is a streamlined process of conducting the research, the science that allows us to say the theories that we're talking about in psychology, the terms we're talking about in psychology, have been validated, right? It's not just assumptions, it's not just beliefs, it's not just perspectives, it's not just guesses. It's actually the truth. That scientific method happens within a couple different stages. It really starts with observation. And this isn't really what I'd call a formal part of the process, right? People, we're just kind of naturally observant. We're always watching other people. We're always watching our surroundings. It's just part of being a human. Oftentimes, we kind of connect dots just naturally through the course of our day. That's part of human nature. So that's not really a formal part of the scientific method. Researchers, psychologists do the same thing, right? They wonder about different things. They try to connect dots in their everyday lives. Now, sometimes these can be really relevant, and they may think, you know what, maybe this is something I could do a research project on. So an example of that is, me as a psychologist, maybe I'm just looking around. I'm like, you know what? I see a lot of college students with their phones out during class, like a lot. And they're like out a lot during class also, right? So not just a lot of students are doing it, but like they're doing it for most of the class. So that's kind of interesting, right? That's just an observation I noticed. Now, maybe I want to go the next step and kind of come up with a theory behind it. We call a hypothesis. So a hypothesis uh, is really kind of the basis of what your research is going to be, right? So if I wanted to do research on this, maybe I came up with this observation where I'm like, I've seen all these students on their phones. I noticed that student grades have kind of gone down a little bit. What if, and this is just my assumption now, what if phones are interfering with people's ability to pay attention in class? And then that's causing their grades to suffer. Well, wow, maybe that's a good thing to do a research study on. What if I did like an experiment on this or something, right? Well, the first thing I need to do is come up with a hypothesis. What am I actually studying? What is my theory here? What is my belief? What am I going to be testing? Usually the hypothesis is one sentence long. Usually it's what I call an if-then format. It has to have a causal relationship. What does that mean? It means that you're saying that something affects something else, right? So students using their cell phones in class causes them to have poorer grades in that class, right? That's a causal relationship. What's causing lower grades? Students on their phones. Now, the next step then, I have my hypothesis, is I have to develop how I'm going to study this, what kind of research I'm going to do. Now, you see here it says experiment. Not every study in psychology or any science really is just an experiment, right? There's different types of research, and you see that included over here. An experiment usually involves a control group and an experimental group. This is where you're actually doing something different with those groups to try to prove that there's some kind of evidence that an intervention or something you're adding has an effect. So in the example I'm using, what I would do is I would have like one class where students weren't allowed to use their phones, right? They weren't even allowed to bring their phones in. And then I'd have another class where there'd be no rules. And then at the end of the semester, I would find out which of those classes had the higher grade, right? That would be an experiment. In that case, my control group would be the students who weren't using their phone, and the other would be the students who were allowed to use their phone. So that's one type of study. Usually experiments are kind of like the gold standard. They can actually show a cause and effect relationship. Um, Way beyond the scope of this class, but sometimes there's some limits to doing those experiments. So there's other types of research that's available. Correlational research is where we look at data statistics to try to find a connection. So in that case, with what I was talking about, cell phone use in poor grades, maybe I just send out like a survey to all the students at Herzing University at the end of a term. And I asked them, on average, how much are they using their phones during class periods and what their grade in that class was, right? I can collect data then, and probably collect a lot of data, and I can kind of graph it, right? So I would do actually like a little graph. And on one hand, I'd look at something like minutes spent on the phone during class, and on the other end of that graph, I'd look at what that student's grade was. And that gives me a statistical information that I can go off of. Descriptive studies and case studies really are a little less scientifically valid as far as showing any kind of cause and effect. Really what they're doing there is this is kind of like, think of it more of an example would be like you writing like a book report on something, right? So it's maybe you exploring things based upon available data that you find online or find that other people have done. The types of research, very important. I mentioned that along with the announcement where I send out the recording, I'll also include links. I include little micro-learning videos that I would really encourage you all to look at that goes into detail and talks about what an experiment is, how it's done, what correlational research is, how it's done, what it looks like. And it's a lot more easier to understand. So I always encourage students, please, please, please check out those links. It'll always be included underneath the announcements where I send the recording for the lecture for that week. All right, so that's types of research. Going back over here, right? So it says experiment can be any type of research. Once that's done, I am going to have data. I collect that data, I analyze that data, and then I come up with a conclusion. In this case, if I'm talking about students using their phones during class, and I do the experiment that I mentioned, right? I have one class where they're using their phones, another class where they're not allowed to use their phone. Maybe at the end of that, I collect the data, I find out, yeah, sure enough, the class where the students are using their phones, they actually had a lower average grade at the end of the term than the students who weren't using their phone, right? So I can analyze that and come up with a conclusion. I can say, based upon this experiment, it kind of points to the fact that maybe students using their phones in class time actually hurts their grade. Now, the very, very important part of the scientific method is I will then publish those findings, right? I'll do an article, I'll put it out there, and that's open for anybody out there reading that article to challenge me, to say, you know what, I think you're wrong. I think you did the study incorrectly, or I think you came up with the wrong conclusion. And the key part of this is, even if I'm right? Even if nobody can challenge it, it has to be replicated. It's just not enough to do it once. It has to be done several times, because that shows that it's not just a fluke, right? That this is something that could happen many times. In the example I gave also, it's kind of important to know, okay, so I'm doing this with 2 classes at Herzing, but is that representative of all college students across the entire country? Maybe those classes were hybrid classes on teams. Is it the same thing for in-person classes? Is it the same thing in other countries outside the United States? Maybe that's just an American thing of using your phone during class period. You kind of see where I'm going with that, right? That would all come up during that replication period. All right, so that is kind of all I'm going to talk about in this lecture about the scientific method and kind of the basis of psychology and science. Now I'm going to move on to talking about different psychological perspectives. And keep in mind, sometimes these are kind of known by different topics in the textbook and in the resources in the class. They say psychological perspective. Sometimes you'll hear them called theories, modalities, fields, all sorts of different things. Basically, psychology has a lot of different viewpoints of looking at those things I just mentioned, right? Looking at mind and behavior, looking at how people think, how they feel, how they behave. Even though psychology is a science, it's not a science in the sense of like physics, right? So physics can come up with like a mathematical formula that can explain something like gravity. as an example. I always like to say there's the famous formula from uh, Albert Einstein, the theory of relativity, E equals mc squared, right? We can't come up with that in psychology to describe why somebody may have an addiction to something or why somebody may end up with a psychological disorder. Why? Well, because every human being is completely unique, and the experiences they face throughout the totality of their life is completely unique. We can come up with some different theories that are broad theories, but no one theory could ever hope to kind of describe everything. It's just not possible. So there is no one size fits all method for understanding human thoughts, human feelings, or behaviors. There have been multiple different theories or perspectives then that have developed over about, I'd say, the last 120 years. In the next slide, I'm going to talk about some of the most common current perspectives. Some of the perspectives that have come up really aren't really what I would consider mainstream today. Um, some of them have kind of evolved a little bit. So in the next slide, I'll talk about some of the more common modern ones. Each of these different schools of thought or perspectives offer a different lens on mind and behavior, different lens on the field of psychology. And really, modern professionals within psychology kind of used a combined approach. So, what I mean by that is not everybody just kind of sticks with one type of perspective in doing, say, something like counseling. As a counselor myself, the way I like to explain this is that working with clients, working with my patients, I kind of look at it as being sort of like painting. Sounds weird, right? Stay with me. If I'm a painter, and I'm not a painter, I'm not artistic anyway, but I'm going to have my, I don't know what you call it, palette out, right? With all these different colors. Me painting means I may use some red here, some blue here, some brown there, some white, some black. All of those coming together is what makes the painting. Well, me as a counselor, I may use a little bit of this perspective in this setting with a client. And then maybe that client went through something in their life, something came up, maybe they're dealing with some stressful events, and that perspective doesn't really work that well. So I may have to shift and kind of use another perspective. So we kind of paint with the rainbow when it comes to psychology. And this is actually, like I said, kind of one of the strengths. So in the next slide, I'll talk about some of these. I'll give examples of each of them, and then I'll kind of talk about how these could all come together and how I, as a counselor, may use all of them when I'm dealing even with one client, like the same client. All right, so getting into the actual major psychological perspectives, this can be broken down a couple different ways, but I'd say generally speaking, there's six major perspectives that are still around today that are still pretty relevant. So those six are psychoanalysis, behaviorism, cognitive psychology, humanistic psychology, social psychology, and then biopsychology, or sometimes it's called neuroscience or neuropsychology. It goes by a couple different names. So I'll go down the list here. I'm going to talk about each one. I'll talk briefly about what it is, and I'll give examples of maybe how you would use it. And at the end, I'll talk about what was just mentioned on that previous slide, how modern day practitioners of psychology can oftentimes kind of intersperse and interchange what they're actually applying to their clients. So up first, we have psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was first uncovered, created in about 1900, a few years plus or minus, by a man named Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is probably one of the most influential psychologists of all time. And his focus was that he believed that humans have kind of these unconscious motives. He believed that these unconscious motives were shaped oftentimes by our childhood experiences. Um, Oftentimes those were traumas, but not always. Like, for example, Freud believed things like potty training could even kind of leave a lasting mark on us psychologically. And this is the key, right? When I say unconscious, What I mean by that is that we're not really aware of it, but it still sticks with us. And what Freud believed was that these unconscious tendencies or motives, especially if it was stemming from like a point of conflict or tension, will stay with us well into adulthood and could lead to us having psychological problems. And it could be kind of difficult to unlock it because we can't really describe it, right? Because it's unconscious. It comes back from our childhood. So I'll give you an example of this, right? If, for example, one of the things that Freud kind of believed strongly in was that when we're babies, if we are, say, particularly fussy, and say our mom, our dad, our caregivers, whoever it was, maybe dealt with that by noticing that, hey, you know what, my baby's a lot less fussy if I just feed him or her. So every time I'm crying as a baby, I'm being fed or I'm getting a pacifier in my mouth. What Freud believed was that that could start creating this kind of unconscious tendency that if I'm feeling emotional, I'm going to soothe myself through doing something like my mouth, eating or smoking or biting my fingernails. Now, I'm not saying that's mainstream psychology. It really isn't. It's way more complex than that. But that was kind of the early focus of what Freud thought. And indeed, to this day, I mean, oftentimes, I'm sure most of us can kind of relate to that idea of like, sometimes we do things and maybe we're not even really sure why we did it. Especially when we're younger. But I'd say even as adults, sometimes it's like, man, I just don't know. Like there's this sometimes this kind of unconscious part of me that's kind of moving me towards a certain direction. Right. So that's really the underpinning of psychoanalysis. If you go to see a therapist who specializes in psychoanalysis, or what we call today, the therapy is called psychodynamic psychotherapy, they will always look at the past, or almost always, right? So say I have anxiety and I'm going to see a therapist. I'm like, I need help. I have tons of anxiety. Help me out with this, right? A psychodynamic psychotherapist using the psychoanalysis would probably start by saying, let's talk about the past. Tell me about your childhood. Tell me about your mom. Tell me about your dad. Do you have siblings? Like, what was your childhood like? That's really kind of going to be the key at that. And incidentally, if you've ever heard of things like dream interpretation, this idea that your dreams have all this unlocked hidden meaning, that comes from Freud. That comes from psychoanalysis. All right, so next one, we have behaviorism. Behaviorism also came about around that same time that psychoanalysis did, so around 1900, give or take a few years. Whereas psychoanalysis focuses on the mind, your thoughts, your emotions, and the unconscious parts of your mind, behaviorism focuses on, you guessed it, behavior. It focuses on what's observable, and especially how people kind of interact with their environmental surroundings, with their other people that they interact with. A good way of remembering it is that behaviorism really kind of deals with learning, but it's not the learning that you're thinking of like studying or like what you're doing now. It's really more of like how you learned to behave the way you behave. So, for example, I am a very extroverted person. I tend to be very talkative, right? Probably helps out that I'm a therapist and that I'm also a teacher, right? Because that's definitely two good professions to be in for somebody who likes to talk. Uh, behaviorism, looking at that, why am I that way? How did I learn to become more extroverted and talkative? Well, maybe it's because growing up, I kind of like had one of those families where everybody was talking all the time. I come from one of those really loud, boisterous kind of families. And it was one of those situations where if you didn't also become kind of loud and boisterous and speak up, nobody was going to pay attention to you. So behaviorism would say, I got a benefit or a reward, or what they call a reinforcement. Because if I spoke up and I was more extroverted, I got attention, which was a reward. If I didn't speak up, I was kind of overlooked, and they call it a punishment in behaviorism, but it's just sort of like, you know, a negative consequence or a bad consequence. Now, with behaviorism, a lot of times what happens is that you see where this is used in actual like psychology and therapy. in a couple of different ways, but probably the most pronounced one is if anybody has ever had any experience with autism, maybe you have a loved one, a family member, maybe yourself has autism. One of the primary treatments for autism is something called applied behavior analysis, or ABA, and it is firmly rooted in behaviorism. So, for example, autism is very impactful to social skills. So behaviorism may look at a young child that's having these problems with socializing and kind of encourage the child by giving them a reward or a reinforcement for engaging in the type of socialization that most children would have if they didn't have the autism, and to kind of discourage or ignore those behaviors that may be counterproductive to socialization. Cognitive psychology. So here's the thing. Cognitive psychology is kind of similar to psychoanalysis in that it looks at the inner workings of the mind, right? So we're not talking about behavior. We're not talking about observable things like behaviorism. We're going back to talking about, thoughts, feelings, beliefs. The difference, though, is that cognitive psychology really doesn't have a big emphasis on this idea of an unconscious mind. What it looks at more is conscious thoughts, right? So you can explain how you think and feel because these are things that you can explain. So we're not talking about childhood trauma or anything like that. So cognitive psychology studies internal mental processes like memory, problem solving, perception, and really so much more. Like language is part of this, intelligence is part of this. So a lot of different things. With cognitive psychology, I could say when it came along, which was about the 1960s or so, it kind of did largely replace psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is still around today, it's just not as common. Cognitive psychology definitely kind of took over. Um, a good distinction here, remember I said that with psychoanalysis, if I went to see somebody who used that and say I had anxiety, they're going to go back and they're going to look at what my past was. They're not really going to focus on the present. How is cognitive psychology different from that? So I go to a cognitive psychologist, I say, I'm having problems with anxiety. They're not going to want to talk about the past, more or less. They're going to want to know what's bringing about the anxiety. And maybe if I said something like, well, every time I take a test in class, like I'm a college student and I take a test, I have a panic attack. It's hard for me to breathe, to focus. I feel like my heart's just gonna beat out of my chest. A cognitive psychologist would start saying, well, what are your thoughts going into that test? How do you feel about that environment? Like, explain this to me, right? So the idea is if they can identify something like in that case, test anxiety because you have a fear of failure, then they can help work on changing that fear of failure so you no longer have the test anxiety. Humanistic psychology. So humanistic psychology came along at about the mid part of the 20th century, and it emphasizes free will, personal growth, and self-actualization. This is the way I like to explain humanistic psychology. So remember, I said it came around about mid part of the 20th century. Prior to humanistic psychology kind of taking shape, the idea of psychology and a psychologist was that you were first and foremost a scientist. You were a researcher. If you had a client, you had a patient, you weren't dealing with a person, you were dealing with a problem. Somebody came into my practice and they have anxiety. I'm not looking at them as being, Dave or Bill or Juan or whoever. I'm looking at them as a person with anxiety and primarily as the anxiety, and that's it. It was very scientific. It was very detached. So our ideas today of kind of like a good bedside manner and somebody you can relate to, that was actually discouraged because they thought by doing that, it would cloud your judgment. When humanistic psychology came up, it kind of challenged this idea and it said, we can't treat problems and people aren't really problems, right? Maybe people have problems, but that doesn't mean they are a problem. So how do we tailor our way of speaking to these people so that they can feel a sense of validation in how they feel, so that they could be motivated to want to better themselves, to grow and to develop, and to reach the self-actualization. It's kind of like reach that part of you that you feel that you should be, right? The best version of yourself. Humanistic psychology is very positive and it's usually very individualistic. So keeping with my example, if I have a client who has a lot of anxiety and I really focus and specialize on humanistic psychology, what I'm going to do is not focus on their past, like with psychoanalysis, not focus on their thoughts that lead to the anxiety, but maybe it's that I'm going to focus on how can I make this person just a happier, healthier, well-rounded individual? How can I make them feel motivated to start doing things that are going to make them feel good about themselves? Yeah, maybe you'll have some anxiety here and there from taking a test or from whatever, but you know what? You probably won't notice that much if you are living a rich, fulfilling, happy life, right? That's the humanistic part. Social psychology. So, social psychology examines how people are influenced by others and their social environments. A lot of times with social psychology, I've been giving you examples of family settings, or I'm sorry, I've been giving you examples of anxiety. So, keeping with that, say if I have a client and I'm really focused on the social aspects of psychology, they're dealing with a lot of anxiety. Maybe it's a young kid. What I would probably look at then, social psychology, is family counseling. How's this family unit coming together? How's this kid's mom, dad, grandparents, siblings working with them? Is it making it better? Is it making it worse? Social psychology, though, is a massive field of study in psychology. I like to joke that it includes everything from who you date to why people hate, right? So things like racism, discrimination, even really dark topics like genocide, mass murder, mass shootings kind of falls within this idea of social psychology. And then also things like, social media use, bullying, and even advertising, believe it or not. A lot of people are kind of shocked to find out that there's actually a lot of psychology behind, the commercials you see on TV or the ads you hear on the radio or little announcements and stuff you get through social media or your email. There's a ton of psychology behind that. And that's really social psychology. Now, the last one on here, biopsychology, like I said, it's kind of known by different names: biopsychology, neuroscience, neuropsychology. With that, what you're really focusing on is the brain, the hormones, the genetics that impact behavior. With biopsychology, we're really focused on the anatomy and physiology behind psychology, behind your behavior. So the focus there is really exploring mostly the brain, largely outside of that, the central nervous system as a whole. A lot of times when we talk about people who specialize in that, we're talking about a medical specialty of psychiatry. There are neuropsychologists, though. So, for example, one big area of neuropsychology is doing things like screening for, diagnosing, and treating people who have like traumatic brain injuries. Um, so I gave you examples of each of these. Now, remember what I said, like it's not like there's any one therapist or team that just focuses on one thing. So, for example, a lot of what I do is I do community-based work with children who have ADHD and autism. Now, I am a therapist, so a lot of times what I do with them is I use some humanistic, I use a little bit of social because I talk to the families, and some cognitive work, right? But I also work with a psychiatrist who is prescribing medication and maybe doing testing to make sure that some of these symptoms aren't effect of some kind of underlying medical condition, right? So you can kind of see how these all come together. And that's just one small example. But sometimes some things work better in one setting and don't work better in another. So that's why we have all these different perspectives and theories within psychology. And this is just a small reflection of how many there really are. So the third and final topic that we're going to talk about is psychology in the workplace. And when we talk about applying theories of psychology to really business settings, that field of study within psychology is called industrial organizational psychology, or we shorten it often to IO. So it's called IO psychology. So IO psychology applies psychology to improve work behavior and performance. It focuses on a couple different areas. Some of the key ones are things like employee selection. So maybe using things like personality tests as part of an interview process so that you're matching candidates with the right personality type to the jobs that really require that personality type. Uh, Another area is workplace culture, kind of in a broader scope, not working with individuals, but looking at, the business or that work environment and saying, okay, is this an environment that really encourages, support, um, healthy workplace interactions, or is it one that maybe has some toxic elements behind it? I'm sure we've all been able to relate to working for a job that has some toxic elements behind it. Leadership development. So that's in the big area where they look at is things like how to be more effective supervisors, communicate more effectively with those who work underneath you. And then also just kind of generally employee well-being. So focus on doing things like reducing stress, improving mental health. So I'll give you an example of this. And actually, this was the first exposure I ever had to an IO psychologist. Um, I mentioned earlier in the video, in my previous life, I like to say, earlier in my career, I actually worked in a totally different field, right? I worked in law enforcement. And the agency that I worked for was a fairly large agency, hired this person to come and do a week-long class. And this class was about um, basically it was like supervisory development. So I was a supervisor at that time. And they had a lot of different corporals, sergeants, lieutenants kind of get together and take this week-long class. In it, they talked about things like communication skills. They talked about, like building teamwork, morale, whatnot. Now, the person who ran this was an IO psychologist, and she specifically focused, even when she was doing her graduate work, specifically on criminal justice field, specifically on police. And it was really interesting. This is the hook, right? So you're probably thinking, well, this doesn't sound that interesting. So this woman, tons of respect for her. I've built a personal relationship with her. We're friends. Uh, she had a contract with the agency that I worked for to come and do this class 3 times a year, right? Out of that week-long class, she actually only showed up for 2 days. The curriculum, she created, so she was paid for it, and she was paid for attending. She didn't live in Florida. That's where I live, is Florida. She lived in Colorado, but she had these contracts all throughout the country. Now keep this in mind, right? I'm wandering here a little bit. She comes 3 times a year just for this agency. She does these all across the country. Just for my agency, they paid her $20,000 for that contract. And remember, that's showing up 3 times a year for 2 days out of that week. So 6 days she made that much money. And she had contracts all across the country. So you do the math on how much money you think she was probably making a year. A lot. Not saying everybody who's an IO psychologist makes that. She found a very specific niche, and she worked that niche very well. She was very good at what she did, and she could prove it too, right? She could show afterwards, hey, supervisors who took this class, had this as an outcome. They were able to show more productivity. They were able to have higher evaluations. The agency I worked for, we did reverse evaluations. So like deputies would rate the supervisors just like how a supervisor would give a performance evaluation to a deputy. So they could show this, right? They actually were able to say, yeah, this is working. Right. And that's a good reflection of what I talked about earlier, right? About science. We can't just say, hey, it's working. Like this woman can't just sit there and say, this class works because I say it works. So give me $20,000. You have to show it's effective. You have to show the evidence. Show me the pudding, right? Show me the proof. Show me the money in this case. And they definitely showed her the money. So that's a good reflection of it. Now, when you look over the material, and this kind of ties into the discussion topic, also ties into the Unit 1 assignment. What I like about psychology in the workplace and IO psychology is that it kind of comes down to that application skill. Because I want you to go through that section kind of thinking, how do I apply this? Like, how would psychology make me a happier, healthier person at my work? I'm sure we all could enjoy working for a company that makes us feel a little bit more supported, better morale, and was more encouraging. So, in closing, remember that psychology really can be applied to any job, any industry, any degree. One of the things that I've mentioned before, I'm very proud of, is that I teach a subject that people are usually pretty interested in and that can be applied in anything. Um, at the end of every term, I always have students tell me, oh, hey, thanks so much for telling me about this. It was really interesting because I can apply it here. And I always say at the end of this term, you will learn one thing, at least one thing that you can apply in your everyday life that would be useful to you, right? And that's a great thing for a college professor to say. Now, hopefully, you'll learn way more than one thing, but I guarantee you'll learn at least one. Um, the big kind of takeaway here, though, too, is how can you apply psychology to your current program of study? Throughout not just this week, but this whole term in this class, what I really encourage you all to do is keep in the back of your head that application aspect. What you're learning isn't just some, vague abstract thing. It's something real, it's something tangible, and it's probably something you see every single day. The more you connect those dots to what you're reading to your everyday life, I could tell you the more you're going to get from this class, the easier it's going to be for you to learn also, and probably the better you will do in the class as far as your grade. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go through this term. So I'm already feeling like a broken record. You're probably thinking I'm sounding like a broken record. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you have concerns, please, 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 please reach out to me. I can't help you if I don't know there's a problem. And usually, if you start having issues or concerns or things you don't really understand, you just say, "Oh, I'll figure it out. Like it'll come together. It's not that big of a deal. Like next week it'll be better." I can tell you, usually those problems just compound. So if you have questions, please reach out to me. And of course, there's plenty of different ways for you to reach out to me. This is my Herzing email address. One thing I would ask you all to do, though, is use the inbox feature in Canvas, because when you send me an email through the inbox feature, it'll populate with the course info, and that's helpful for me to give you a response in a short period of time. Because if you just send me an email from your regular student email, I teach different classes, so sometimes it may be confusing for me to know which class you're in, but if you send me it through that Canvas inbox, I automatically know. So that helps me kind of narrow it down a little bit and give you that answer a lot quicker. Remember, office hours. Office hours are optional. You don't have to show up for it, just like these classes that I do, the live classes, I'll record them. Office hours, I don't record. But if you have questions for me, that's a really good way to go, right? If you don't want to just have a quick question, send me an email or send me an inbox message. Maybe it's a little bit more involved question. Definitely hit me up during those office hours. It's from 12 to 2 Central Time on Fridays. That's done through Zoom. The link for it is on that main landing page when you first click on the course in Canvas. Now, say you really want to meet with me through Zoom, but maybe you work during this time. Maybe you just really can't get away from work or whatever your obligations are. Then send me a message and give me 2 or 3 good options for days or times throughout the week, and I'll try to make it work and meet with you through Zoom, right? So don't just think because you're not available during these set office hours that I won't meet with you. I will. But give me 2 or 3 good options, because otherwise we're going to go back and forth in emails, right? You say, I'm busy on Friday, but can you do Thursday at 6? I'm going to say, I'm not available Thursday at 6, but I could do Wednesday at 5. And you're going to say, I'm not available Wednesday at 5. You get where I'm going with that, right? Um, Definitely, though, please, please, please feel free to reach out if you do have anything. Other than that, folks, that's it. This has been a little over an hour. I try to make these about an hour or so, if not less. Thank you so much for watching all of it. Welcome to the class. I hope you enjoy this course and definitely enjoy this first week's content. Take care, everybody.